It seems sometimes that Joe Biden tends to forget that he's the vice president. That when he says something, it captures the attention not only of the person who's sitting in front of him, but also the whole world. This weekend, the vice president conducted an interview with the Wall Street Journal in which he made comments about the nation of Russia. And he made the comment that their economy is withering, their geopolitical position needs to be reconsidered, they need to draw back their nuclear position in the world and become a more accommodating country. Now, commentators hearing this suggested that Joe Biden was not very sensitive to how diplomatically these comments would be received by the Russians. And in fact, a response from the Russians was very concerned with what these comments had to say with regard to the whole administration's point of view with regard to Russia. It is rather amazing to see the once proud, dominant Soviet Union declining over time to a position now where they are taking more of a minority role in world affairs. Now, they still have considerable power with their nuclear arsenal and their control of gasoline, energy, oil. But their economy continues to suffer, and that does not bode well for their future. It's rather hard to imagine sometimes that major empires will decline, and even perhaps more amazing to think that particular cities, dominant cities, capitals of empires, would so decline that they would come to a place where they would, for all intents and purposes, be a ghost town, like the old towns in the Wild West. Just disappeared. All the people gone. It is hard to see these kinds of things happening, or even to envision such a thing occurring. Can you imagine Moscow being an empty city, lost to civilization? Or Paris, the eternal city, being abandoned by its citizens? Such a thing is hard to imagine. Think of New York City with the millions of people currently within that city. Can you imagine that being a wasteland where no one would inhabit? Such a thing just can't be. Yet Isaiah tells of a day when one of the most glorious cities of his day, or in the near future, would nonetheless so decline in their power and magnificence that they would come to a point of dissolution and destruction, so devastating that no one would want to inhabit that city again. Isaiah tells of this rising power of Babylon, the Babylonians, and says that there's coming a day when their judgment will come. In this 13th chapter, and going on into the 14th chapter of Isaiah, the prophet gives this burden of the Lord with regard to the Babylonians, this oracle, this announcement of God's judgment on this nation. At the time when Isaiah is making this prophecy, it would have probably been rather difficult to see the Babylonians really being a world power of the stature that it would take. They were a rising power, but still the main power at this time was the Assyrian. Calvin speculates that Isaiah was writing at a time towards the end of his ministry on earth. You recall later in the prophecy where he speaks to Hezekiah and warns him of a visit that he had from certain diplomats and representatives from Babylon who come to Jerusalem, and Hezekiah opens before before them all the treasures of Jerusalem. And when Isaiah hears about this, he's very upset. He says, don't you know that these diplomats will come back with reports to Babylon with regard to what you possess, and they will come again, but this time with their armies, to take all that you have. Isaiah would see the rise of the Babylonian nation. But though it might have been rather difficult to see the rise of that power in the near future, it would even be more difficult to see its destruction, and indeed the whole complex of events that would bring about its complete desolation. But that's what Isaiah does here. Speaking under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, who alone can reveal the future and unfold the events that were to occur. The sovereign Lord who has control of history and time and reveals these things to His church, to His people, to the remnant, to the godly there in Jerusalem, reveals them to them so that they could not be too frightened by the rise of the Babylonian power. And as they see the unfolding of God's Word, they can trust more deeply in the promises of God with regard to the coming Messiah. God reveals these things to His people to show that He alone is God. None of the other gods can reveal these kinds of things. And further, because He alone is God in control of history, His promises of salvation and deliverance will be true, and the people of God can rest in these things. So when we read of what God has to say with regard to that ancient kingdom, the Babylonians, and we see the unfolding of history and how these prophecies were fulfilled, we can take a measure of hope and comfort ourselves. This same God who speaks to us of a coming city, the heavenly city, Jerusalem, and the glories of that city, is the one who foretold the devastation and the fall of Babylon. And if we can see that God was true with regard to the fall of Babylon, then we can trust that He is true with regard to the rise of Jerusalem, the coming city of God. God's Word is true, and we can rest in that. We come here to a new section in the book of Isaiah, which I believe, again, is entirely written by the prophet Isaiah during his lifetime. And here in the 13th chapter, going on through the end of the 23rd chapter, I believe it's through the 23rd chapter, Isaiah has a series of messages to the nations outside the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, to the Babylonians, but also the Philistines, the Egyptians, the Moabites, the Edomites, and so forth. Showing that God has a purpose for the nations of the earth. God is Lord not simply of Judah and Jerusalem or of Israel, but He is Lord of the whole earth. The whole world comes before His gaze. And as the sovereign one, He judges between nations. And even though His saving purposes right now are very much confined to what happens in Judah and Jerusalem, He nonetheless remains the Lord of the earth, the one who controls the movements of nations and judges the wicked for their actions.